at the Ojai Music Festival 2013, and we're in the home stretch. This has been the 4:30 concert, and I'm sitting here with John Rockwell, the esteemed critic, formerly of the New York Times, and here in Ojai for your very first time, John?
No. I used to cover this festival. Of course, I was Bernheimer's assistant on the Los Angeles Times in 70, 71 into 72, and Martin would cover it, but I would come. So I came a lot 40 years ago. What I can't remember is whether I ever covered it while I was at the New York Times after 72. I just don't remember, but if I did, it was like a one-shot.
Right.
But it's not. But it's certainly the first time in decades.
Okay. So this particular festival has concentrated rather heavily on West Coast composers. And you've got a special affinity for West Coast performers. What distinguishes them from East Coast performers?
Well, I mean, there's various polemics that go back in contemporary music over the last 100 years. The simplest way of summarizing it would be Bernard Holland, when he was the chief music critic of the New York Times, once dismissed a Lou Harrison concert as just too pretty. And the fact is that there were a lot of different people challenging what seemed at that time like the orthodoxy of the sort of hardcore serialist composers, the people who stole the prayer book from Schoenberg and then made it into a dogma that would have terrified Moses. In other words, the total serialists. I mean, Boulez too, but Boulez's music is always really cool, and there was some pretty good music coming out of the uptown serialist crowd as well. But there were various reactions against that. And the one that was most evident in the 70s was the downtown minimalists, and there was the downtown versus the uptown music. But puttering away all on its own back into the 20s and 30s was music on the West Coast. And the fact that Schoenberg and the wave of immigrants came to L.A. in the late 40s was a kind of interesting twist on that.
Right.
But it was especially in the Bay Area, but Mark Swed will beat the drum loudly, claiming that there was real action down here with Cage and so forth in the 30s as well. But these West Coast guys from Cowell and Harrison and Cage, as the principal ones, but others, carried along, unknown almost to the polemicists on the East Coast who were fighting the uptown-downtown battles. And when they did venture to the East, they were dismissed as simplicists, you know. But there they are. And the fact that Mark Morris, who comes from Seattle but not from California and who's based in New York, has come out here and championed this music, which he's championed all along in using it for especially Cowell and Harrison, and using it for his dances, is kind of wonderful, especially since the previous West Coast California festival that used to champion this stuff, the Cabrillo Festival, has sort of gone national and lost the West Coast connection with Marin Alsop and all. And this festival has what used to be a nest of Stravinskyites, and has been very diverse in its championing of different kinds of new music. So to have the Cowell Harrison Cage crowd being sort of celebrated here is wonderful. And a revelation as far as I'm concerned. Some of this stuff that I have not been familiar with. Cowell is the sort of wild card in all this.
Right.
Because there's so much of the stuff that hasn't even been published. There's 19 symphonies, there's manuscripts that are illegible, there's Joel Sachs's new big musical study and biography of him. I mean, I think we're poised on the precipice of a Cowell revival, which would be great.
You say revival, but was he ever really celebrated?
No. I mean, exhumation would perhaps be a better word. I mean, no, he wasn't. I mean, he was beloved by his pupils and teachers, and I mean, that story that in Eva Soltis's movie about Harrison, where he's sitting in his studio and the door knocks and it's young John Cage, and he shows up and he says, "Hi, Harold, Henry Cowell sent me." And that was all it took. That's the
Right.
instant connection, because he was the guy who welded all these people together and formed a school. I mean, you talk about the New York School of Cage with Feldman and Earl Brown and David Tudor and all that, Christian Wolff and all that. But there was a West Coast school, and Henry Cowell was its leader.
But you back in the 50s, 60s, you really couldn't be taken very seriously by the East Coast crowd unless you were writing a certain brand of music, no?
Well, that's true. But I mean, the polemics are a big deal. And,
Sure.
when you have no money and nobody loves you, then you fight amongst yourselves.
Right.
But it wasn't just Uptown and Downtown. It was the Germanophiles versus the Francophiles.
Sure.
And so the other big schism, at the Copeland Sessions concerts and so forth was between the followers of Schoenberg to some extent, but people who'd been trained in Germany. I mean, Carter wasn't a serialist, but he
Right.
was definitely part of that crowd. And then on the other hand, you had the Francophiles, Virgil Thompson and Samuel Barber and John Carlo Menotti and a million more who tended to be. That was also a little bit of a straight gay thing there too, but the Francophiles tended to be the melodious ones, and the Germanophiles tended to be the hardcore dissonant ones.
Right. Does this music, I mean, most of this music, aside from the John Luther Adams that we've heard, but music of that Ives, Cage, Harrison school, does it sound dated to you in any way?
No.
No?
I mean, it has sometimes in the
Feels
past.
nostalgic to me in a way.
Well, but it's wonderfully so. We live
Right.
in the sense of, Ives bringing American hymns in, and
I don't mean
Cowell
it in any
doing
kind
that.
of pejorative way, but it's
No, well, I mean,
feels
some of these guys are 100 years old in terms of
Right.
the music they were writing.
Right.
One other big difference between the East Coast and the West Coast that we really should mention is that the East Coast looks to Europe and the West Coast looked to Asia.
Right.
And that made a huge difference.
Right.
And I mean, in that one, Cowell certainly played a part, but Harrison was the main man, and Cage to some extent. I mean, but I mean, to make these connections, make these distinctions totally separate is also wrong.
Right.
I mean, Cage went to New York. The percussion orchestra fad of the 30s was big on both coasts. Carlos Chavez was involved, coming up from Mexico. I mean, there was a lot of mixture back and forth, but it tended to separate after the war. After Cowell went to San Quentin and Harrison went to Aptos, not the same as San Quentin, but, and so that there was the distinction, a drift between the two.
So contrast the dynamic of East Coast, West Coast, and what you were just talking about with the scene today, because in a way we've sort of gone to this kind of genreless kind of designation. A lot of composers I know don't want to be tagged as part of any sort of school. Although I suppose
they never did. I
they
mean,
never
no
did, right.
individual artist wants to be thought of as the tertiary member of the subset of
Right.
the school of something and such. But you're right. I mean,
But aside from perhaps Brooklyn, there isn't sort of a geographical kind of cluster, or is that not true?
well, I'm not quite sure who the leaders and the followers and the connectors and so forth on the Brooklyn scene, and the Brooklyn scene is now more and more widespread. I mean, in terms of the influences. I mean, a lot of younger composers are not uptight anymore about the high and low art distinction,
Right.
which is another schism that we didn't mention up till now.
Right.
And none of these West Coast guys that Mark Morris has been championing out here were pop composers.
Right.
I mean, they made use of hymns and tunes, Ives especially, but they subsumed them into an art context.
In a very serious kind of way.
That's right. And now you have composers. I mean, God knows that the dissonance versus consonance battle has long since been won by consonance, and dissonance has become a color that people use, an orchestral color or timbral color that people use for expressive purposes, which is fine. The great system would ensure the superiority of Germany for the next 1,000 years, i.e., the 12-tone music, didn't quite work out that way.
Right.
Nor did the Third Reich.
Right.
But it's a tool, and people use it. So that I don't think. But even at Princeton, people are writing Poisson Rouge kind of music.
Sure.
So those battles have been won. Now, I'm sure there are personal animosities of the glass Reich variety, and there are stylistic schisms, and people are convinced that these guys are on the side of the devil and these are on the side of the angels.
Sure.
But I'm not as up on them as much. It's a later generation.
But I don't get the sense that there's quite the fervor in terms of a battle of ideas. If you think about a lot of what went on in the 20th century, and it was an idea about this kind of music or this kind of way of approaching music.
I think that's
and
right.
Now it's not so much the ideas; it's something else.
And I think that makes for, on the whole, weaker music. I mean, I do think that. I'm always hesitant when people like yourself just now mention those kinds of things, because maybe I'm just out of it and there's really interesting things going on and I'm missing it in some way. But look, with the 20th century was an enormously convulsive century, and you had communism, you had modernism, you had fascism, and all of the sort of aesthetic spin-offs of that, and millions of people killed, and incredible stuff going on.
Not to mention technological revolutions.
That too. Well, that's
revolutions
going on now,
right?
And that's in some ways the most interesting thing that's out there in a way. But you're right that people don't have a passion. They're not convinced that the working class will take over, or the Aryan race will take over, or whatever they think is going to take over.
So does that in a sense make you think that it's more of a what does it sound like? A more of an aesthetic kind of argument rather than an idea kind of argument?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is right. I mean, to the extent that music is still connected in some way with the idea of social change or political change, big time rock and roll has really sort of usurped that.
And even that has passed.
And even that is in a different situation, than it was 30, 40 years ago.
Sure.
So, I think I personally think we're in a kind of a lull in terms of creative energy on all these fronts. On the other hand, there's still cool stuff out there, and if you keep your ears open and try to pursue it, it's there.
Okay. Well, we're about to be invaded by a marching band coming through.
They invaded yesterday. Who are these guys?
It's one of the little surprises of the festival. Anyway, pleasure talking with you.
Thank you, Doug.
We'll return in about 15 minutes for the last of the concerts of the 2013 Ojai Festival. We'll see you in a few minutes.